We always thought the galaxy was a civilized place. We fought our wars with rules of engagement. We died with honor. But when the synthetic hive mind of the Vector pushed us to the absolute brink of extinction, we finally realized that honor was just another word for suicide. In our final hours bleeding out in the freezing mud of a dying world, we sent a blind plea into the dark. We begged the universe for angels. Instead, it sent us the true monsters. It sent humanity. Rain fell on the trenches of Oakhaven, but it wasn't water. It was a caustic, ash-choked slurry that smelled of burning copper and vaporized bone. Commander Terrace huddled against the vibrating earth, his four-fingered hands pressed hard against his helmet. The ground didn't just shake, it convulsed. Every rhythmic thud of the Vector artillery sent a shockwave through the mud that rattled Terrace's teeth and threatened to snap his spine. He was a veteran of the Coda Alliance, a species that had proudly maintained peace in the Orion Spur for 3 centuries. Now they were just meat, waiting to be processed. Terrace peered over the edge of the parapet. The sky was an ugly, bruised purple, choked with the smoke of 100 burning cities. Below them, across the desolate expanse of no man's land, the Vector were advancing. They didn't march. They flowed, a sea of jagged biomechanical horrors, all razor wire limbs and glowing red optical sensors. They moved in perfect, terrifying silence, broken only by the mechanical hum of their plasma casters and the sickening crunch of their metallic claws tearing through the corpses of Terrace's fallen soldiers. There were no war cries, no hesitation, just the cold, algorithmic certainty of extermination. Commander, Terrace flinched, pulling his head down just as a beam of superheated blue plasma sheared the top off the sandbag he'd been using for cover. The molten slag splattered against the armor of the soldier crouching next to him. It was Kale, his comms officer. The young soldier was clutching a field radio to his chest like a newborn child. Kyle's armor was cracked, his breathing ragged. Blue blood leaked from a deep laceration across his neck. "Report!" Taurus barked, his voice hoarse from yelling over the deafening roar of the orbital bombardment. "The western flank has collapsed," Kyle choked out, spitting a glob of blue blood into the ash-stained mud. "The 4th Battalion is gone, vaporized. The Vector have breached the outer perimeter. We have maybe 20 minutes before they overrun the command trench." Taris closed his eyes. 20 minutes. 3 centuries of art philosophy and interstellar diplomacy reduced to 20 minutes in the mud. The Coda fought with elegant energy weapons, seeking to disable and disarm. The Vector simply eradicated. You couldn't reason with a machine intelligence that viewed biological life as a computational error. "Did the distress signal go out?" Terrace asked. It was a hollow question, a formality before death. "It's been broadcasting on an unencrypted loop for 6 hours, Kyle said, his voice cracking. Panic was finally breaking through his military discipline. General frequency, maximum range. Every species in the sector heard it. The Altari, the Phelan, the Krell. And Kyle looked down at the mud. Nothing. Silence. The Altari pulled their fleets back to their home system. The Phelan surrendered 2 days ago. "We are alone, Commander." Taris leaned his head back against the dirt wall. He looked at the surviving members of his platoon. 30 exhausted, mutilated soldiers shivering in a flooded trench. Their plasma rifles were depleted. Their armor was failing. They were dead men breathing. Keep it broadcasting, Terrace said quietly. If nothing else, let the galaxy hear how we die. Let it be a record. He drew his sidearm. The power cell indicator blinked a pathetic low battery yellow. He had exactly 3 shots left. 3 shots for a horde of 10,000 machines. The math was brutally simple. Suddenly, Cale's radio shrieked. It wasn't a transmission. It was a burst of raw, unformatted static that sliced through the encrypted channels with the grace of a blunt axe. The sheer volume of the interference made Taris's audio dampeners squeal in protest. "What is that?" Taris shouted, grabbing Kyle's shoulder. "Are they jamming us?" Kyle frantically adjusted the dials on his chest, his fingers slipping on his own blood. "No, it's not the vector. It's coming from orbit. Someone is dumping massive amounts of telemetry data on our frequency. It's primitive, unencrypted radio waves, just raw audio." "Put it on the external speakers," Taris ordered. Kale slapped the relay switch. Through the crackle of static, a voice echoed in the trench. It didn't speak the melodic mathematical language of the coda, nor the synthesized binary of the vector. It was harsh, guttural, deeply organic, and dripping with a strange, dark exhaustion. The translation matrix in Taris's helmet struggled for a moment, whirring as it parsed the dead language before rendering it into standard coda. "Coda command, this is United Earth ship Grave Robber. We read your SOS. Hold your breath and keep your heads down. We're dropping the hammer." Taris froze. United Earth. The humans. He knew the stories. Every species did. Humanity was a quarantined race locked away in a chaotic hostile system at the edge of the spiral arm. They were an evolutionary anomaly, a species that had spent its entire history slaughtering itself over imaginary borders and invisible gods. The Galactic Council had deemed them too violent, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to integrate. They were left in isolation, a dark stain on the stellar map. Humans! Kyle whispered, his eyes wide, with a mix of awe and terror. They answered. Before Taris could process the reality of the transmission, the sky tore open. There was no flash of hyperspace energy, no elegant warping of light. The human arrival was as subtle as a brick thrown through a glass window. The clouds above Oakhaven didn't just part. They were violently displaced by a massive pressure wave. A thunderclap rolled across the battlefield so loud it ruptured the eardrums of 3 of Taris's men. The Vector machines momentarily paused their advance, their optical sensors tilting upward to calculate the sudden atmospheric anomaly. Through the heavy smoke, the human fleet appeared. Taris had seen the sleek silver dreadnoughts of the Altari and the glowing crystalline frigates of the Phelan. Those were ships designed by artists and engineers. The human ships were designed by butchers. They were horrific brutalist slabs of matte black metal and scarred armor plating. They had no aerodynamic symmetry, no graceful curves. They looked like massive flying ironworks bristling with exposed pipework heat radiators and oversized gun batteries. They didn't glide through the atmosphere. They bullied their way in engines screaming as they fought the planet's gravity. "Coda forces danger. Close." The harsh human voice crackled over the radio again. "I repeat, danger. Close. Plugging your ears won't help." "Get down!" Taris screamed, tackling Kale into the deepest part of the muddy trench. He expected laser fire. He expected pinpoint orbital strikes to surgically remove the vector front lines. He didn't expect the humans to simply throw rocks. High above the human dreadnoughts opened their launch bays. They didn't fire energy weapons. Instead, they dropped solid telephone pole-sized rods of dense tungsten directly from orbit. The kinetic bombardments hit the ground with the force of tactical nuclear warheads. The impact was apocalyptic. The ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. A blinding flash of kinetic energy turned the night into a harsh, glaring midday. A wall of dirt shattered metal, and superheated air washed over the coda trenches, burying Taris in a foot of debris. When the roaring finally stopped, a terrifying silence fell over the battlefield. Taris shoved the dirt off his back, coughing violently as he clawed his way to the edge of the trench. His helmet visor was cracked, and his left arm was completely numb. He looked out over no man's land. The Vector front line was gone, not retreated, not disabled, gone. Where the horde of machines had stood seconds ago, there was now a string of massive glowing craters, each 100 meters wide, pooling with molten glass and pulverized earth. The sheer unapologetic devastation made Taris's stomach turn. This wasn't war. It was landscaping via high explosives, but the Vector were a swarm. They numbered in the millions. From the smoke beyond the craters, the secondary wave began to pour forward, climbing over the glowing wreckage of their predecessors. They adapted instantly, spreading their formations out to minimize damage from further orbital strikes. Then came the drop pods. They fell from the bellies of the human ships like iron rain. No retro thrusters gently guiding them down, no energy shields, just heavily armored steel coffins burning fiercely as they slammed through the atmosphere. They hit the earth just 50 meters ahead of the coda trenches, embedding themselves deep into the mud with deafening metallic crunches. Taris stared at the black monoliths dotting the shattered landscape. Steam hissed from their heat-scorched hulls. With synchronized explosive pops, the heavy steel doors blew outward, kicking up clouds of ash. From the smoke, they emerged. The humans were massive. Encased in bulky battle-scarred power armor, they stood easily a head taller than the tallest coda soldier. Their armor wasn't uniform. It was painted in dull matte greens and grays covered in scratches, crude tally marks, and hastily welded patch jobs. Their helmets were faceless, featuring only narrow, glowing visors that cut through the gloom. They didn't march in formation. They spread out in loose predatory stances, their heavy boots sinking into the muck. The Vector swarm charged them. Thousands of razor-limbed machines shrieking as they closed the distance plasma casters charging. A human at the front of the line, marked with a crude white skull painted on his chest plate, racked the bolt of a weapon that looked entirely too large for any infantryman to carry. "Let 'em have it," a voice barked over the open comms, and humanity unleashed hell. The sound of human weaponry was a physical assault. The coda were used to the sharp, high-pitched crack of laser rifles. The human guns roared, they barked, they chattered with a deafening percussive violence that made the air itself vibrate. The human with the skull on his chest, whose armor read coal in faded stenciling, opened fire with an enormous rotary cannon. A solid stream of depleted uranium rounds tore into the Vector front line. It didn't just pierce their armor, it shattered them. Synthetic limbs, optical sensors, and chassis fragments exploded outward in a shower of sparks and black oil. To Taris's right, another human stepped forward. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a thick nozzle attached to a heavy tank on his back. The human pulled a trigger. A stream of thick black liquid shot forward instantly, igniting into a roaring torrent of liquid fire. The napalm splashed against the charging vector, sticking to their metal chassis. The machines didn't feel pain, but physics didn't care. The intense clinging heat melted their optical sensors, fused their joints, and cooked their internal processors. Dozens of vector collapsed into the mud, thrashing blindly as the unquenchable fire consumed them. The stench of burning fuel and melting ozone was overpowering. Taris watched in utter paralyzed horror. This was barbaric. This was chemical and kinetic warfare banned by the Galactic Council centuries ago as cruel and unusual. The humans weren't just destroying the enemy. They were obliterating them with a terrifying primal efficiency. They used the mud. They used fire. They used the sheer brute force of hyper-accelerated lead. A vector drone, a massive four-legged unit armed with a heavy plasma scythe, leaped over the burning wreckage, landing directly in front of a human soldier. The machine swung its scythe, aiming to decapitate the heavily armored primate. The human didn't dodge. He stepped into the swing, catching the plasma blade on the thick armor plating of his left forearm. The metal hissed, glowing red hot, but the armor held. With his free hand, the human drew a heavy serrated combat knife, slammed it into the joint of the machine's neck, and ripped downward. Sparks showered as the human physically tore the machine's optical processor out of its chassis, kicking the twitching bulk of metal into the dirt. Taris felt Kale grab his arm. The young soldier was trembling. "Commander!" Kyle whispered, his eyes wide as he watched the humans carve through the unbeatable vector horde like they were made of dry wood. "What did we invite into our home? Survival," Taris replied, though his own voice shook. A massive explosion rocked the trench line as a human threw a bundle of high explosives into a cluster of vector. Dirt and shredded metal rained down on Taris's helmet. The human advance was relentless. They didn't seek cover. They walked into the withering plasma fire of the vector, their heavy armor absorbing hits that would have vaporized a Coda soldier. When a human did fall, and Taris saw a few go down their armor, finally failing under concentrated fire, the others didn't retreat. They just moved forward, stepping over their dead firing with an even colder, more terrifying rage. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over the trench. Taris looked up his hand instinctively, going to his depleted sidearm. Standing on the edge of the parapet was a human soldier. Her armor was scorched black on the left side, and a fresh gouge ran across her visor. She looked down at Taris, the glowing optics of her helmet studying the battered alien commander. With a hiss of depressurization, the human reached up and unlatched her helmet, pulling it off. Taris braced himself, expecting to see a monster. Instead, he saw a face caked in sweat ash and dirt. It was a soft face, biologically speaking. No scales, no mandibles, no armored plating. Just pale skin, dark eyes, and a streak of blood running down her cheek from a cut on her forehead. Her eyes were exhausted. They carried the weight of a species that had been fighting since the day it learned to walk upright. She looked at Taris, then glanced at the 30 terrified, bleeding Coda soldiers huddled in the mud behind him. "You the guy in charge?" she asked. Her voice, unfiltered by the radio, was raspy and breathless, but surprisingly calm given the slaughter happening 50 yards away. The translator in Taris's earpiece rendered it perfectly. Taris swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand. He was an officer. He would die on his feet. "I am Commander Taris of the Coda Alliance." he said, trying to keep the tremble out of his voice. Are you the backup? The human woman spat a glob of blood into the mud. She wiped her mouth with the back of her armored gauntlet, her dark eyes locking onto his. Name's Sergeant Hayes, she said flatly. And yeah, we're the backup. She looked back out at the battlefield. The Vector swarm was faltering. For the first time in a decade of war, the machines were retreating, unable to calculate a victory against an enemy that simply refused to die. The human guns continued to roar, chewing up the fleeing machines. Hayes looked back down at Therese, a cynical, weary smirk breaking through the grime on her face. Sorry we took so long, Hayes said, reattaching her helmet to her collar. Traffic was a bitch. Patch your medics through to our frequency. We brought bandages. She turned away, racking the slide of her heavy shotgun. Come on, apes, Hayes roared over the external speakers, her voice echoing across the burning plains. They're falling back. Push the line. Nothing survives. Terrace watched her jump down from the parapet, charging back into the fray. He listened to the chaotic, brutal roar of human artillery smelling the burning oil and melting metal of the unbeatable Vector swarm. He looked at Kale. The young soldier had finally stopped shaking. The galaxy had always told the Coda that humanity was a disease, a violent rabid dog locked in the basement of the universe. But as Taris watched the monsters tear the Vector apart to protect a species they had never even met, he realized the galaxy had been wrong. The universe didn't need philosophers when the wolves came to the door. It needed a bigger, meaner dog. And the humans were off the leash. The silence that followed the human counteroffensive was heavier than the artillery barrage. It was the thick, suffocating quiet of a graveyard, freshly dug. Smoke drifted lazily over no man's land, carrying the bitter scent of cooked ozone and charred synthetic flesh. The Vector were gone. For the first time in 6 months, the horizon was empty of their glowing red optics. Taris stepped out of the command trench. His boots sank into mud that was now a mixture of ash-blue Coda blood and thick black Vector oil. Around him, the human soldiers were already moving. They didn't celebrate. There were no cheers of victory. They worked with a grim mechanical efficiency that mirrored the machines they had just destroyed. Sergeant Hayes walked past him, a smoking cigar clamped between her teeth. She carried her heavy shotgun resting on her shoulder. Her armor was pitted and scarred, the dull green paint stripped away in places to reveal raw, unpolished steel. Miller, Hayes barked, her voice rough. Get the triage tent set up. Briggs wants a sit rep in 10, and I want these blue bastards patched up before they bleed out on my boots. A human medic, wearing lighter armor marked with a faded red cross, jogged past. On it, Sarge. Miller dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag into the mud and unzipped it. He didn't pull out automated healing fields or sterile surgical drones. He pulled out rolls of gauze, thick syrettes of clear liquid, and heavy steel trauma shears. Taris watched as Miller knelt beside Kale. The young comms officer was still clutching his neck, his blue blood seeping through his fingers. Miller gently but firmly pushed Kale's hands away. Easy, kid, Miller said. His voice was surprisingly soft, contrasting sharply with his bulky armor and the dirt smeared across his visor. Let the doc take a look. Miller pulled a small flashlight from his chest rig and clicked it on, inspecting the laceration. Severed vein, messy, but fixable. You guys got copper-based blood, right? Kale just stared, eyes wide, with residual shock, unable to comprehend the primitive nature of the human's medical kit. Taris stepped forward, his translator whirring. Yes, copper-based. Our physiology is similar enough to a horseshoe crab. Miller interrupted, pulling a thick needle and a spool of black thread from his kit. Good news is the cold mud probably slowed the bleeding. Bad news is this is gonna sting. Taris expected Miller to deploy a local anesthetic field. Instead, the medic simply plunged a thick syringe into Kyle's shoulder. Kyle gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly as the human painkillers hit his system. Before Kale could fully process the sensation, Miller was already working. He didn't use lasers to cauterize the wound. He used the needle and thread, physically stitching the torn flesh back together with rapid, precise movements. It was barbaric. It was a violation of modern medical protocols, and it was saving Kale's life right in front of Taris's eyes. You fight like savages and you heal like tailors, Taris said quietly, watching Kale's breathing stabilize. Miller tied off the stitch and snipped the thread with his shears. He looked up at Taris, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. If it's stupid and it works, Commander, it ain't stupid. Welcome to human medicine. We plug the holes so you can keep breathing. The pretty scars come later. Taris looked across the battlefield. Human soldiers were dragging the twisted chassis of dead Vector into large piles. Others were carefully collecting their own dead, wrapping them in thick black tarps. The reverence they showed their fallen was striking. They handled the bodies with a gentle care that completely contradicted the ferocious violence they had displayed just minutes prior. Hayes reappeared, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked at Taris, her expression unreadable. Your boy going to make it? Thanks to your medic, yes, Taris replied. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim some semblance of military dignity. Sergeant Hayes, I must formally express the gratitude of the Coda Alliance. Your intervention was unprecedented. We assumed humanity was still restricted to the Sol system. Hayes let out a short, humorless laugh. She tossed the dirty rag into a puddle. The Galactic Council put a lock on our door, Commander. They just forgot to check if we knew how to pick it. She pointed a thumb over her shoulder toward the massive, blocky dropship that had landed a few hundred yards behind the trench line. Its engines were still idling, kicking up clouds of dirt. Come on, Hayes said, turning to walk toward the ship. Colonel Briggs wants a word, and you're going to need a stiff drink before he gives you the bad news. Taris felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The bad news. The Vector had just been annihilated. What could possibly be worse? He followed Hayes through the mud, leaving his battered platoon in the hands of the human medics. As they approached the dropship, the sheer scale of human engineering became apparent. The hull was a patchwork of thick armor plates held together by massive, ugly welds. It looked like a flying brick designed with absolutely zero regard for aesthetics. It was built for one purpose: to deliver violence directly to the enemy's doorstep. The interior of the human dropship smelled like stale coffee sweat and gun oil. It was cramped, dimly lit by red tactical bulbs, and entirely devoid of the holographic elegance found in Coda command centers. Hayes led Taris into a central compartment where a large, battered metal table took up most of the space. Scattered across the table were actual paper maps, heavily annotated with thick black markers, alongside a few rugged data pads displaying chaotic scrolling code. Leaning over the table was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He didn't wear a helmet revealing a shaved head and a face crisscrossed with pale, jagged scars. His armor was bulkier than Hayes's, painted a dark, flat gray. A silver eagle insignia was pinned haphazardly to his collar. This was Colonel Briggs. Briggs looked up as Taris entered. His eyes were a pale, icy blue. They were the eyes of a predator, analyzing its prey, calculating weight distance and weaknesses in a fraction of a second. Taris felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine. The humans didn't just fight, they hunted. "Commander Taris," Briggs said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Taris's chest. "Have a seat. Drink this." Briggs pushed a battered metal flask across the table. Taris hesitated, then picked it up. He unscrewed the cap and took a cautious sip. The liquid burned like battery acid sliding down his throat. He choked, coughing violently as the harsh, fiery spirit flooded his senses. Briggs chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Bourbon. It puts hair on your chest, or in your case, scales. Whatever you've got under that armor." Taris wiped his mouth, his eyes watering. "It is potent. Colonel Briggs, I cannot overstate. Save the diplomatic bullshit, Commander." Briggs interrupted, waving a massive hand. "We didn't come here for medals. We didn't come here because we like you. Frankly, humanity doesn't give a damn about the Galactic Council or its politics. They locked us in a cage for 300 years because they thought we were monsters." Briggs leaned across the table, planting his fists on the map. "But when the Vector showed up, all those civilized, enlightened species suddenly realized that philosophy doesn't stop plasma fire. The Altari ran, the Phelan folded, and you were dying in the mud." Taris swallowed hard. "Then why did you come?" Briggs's expression hardened. "Because we know what the Vector are. The Council thinks they're a rogue defense AI. They think they're a virus. They're wrong." Briggs tapped a thick finger on a heavily circled area of the paper map. "The Vector are an extermination protocol, and they don't stop. They don't negotiate. They don't take prisoners. They are a mirror reflecting the universe's absolute worst nightmare. A perfect, logical killing machine." He looked directly into Taris's eyes. "Humanity came because if we let them eat you, they'll eventually come for us. We're not your saviors, Commander. We're your immune system. And right now, the galaxy has a terminal infection." Taris stared at the map. It wasn't a map of Oakhaven. It was a star chart of the entire sector. Large swathes of the map were blacked out with marker. "What is the bad news, Colonel?" Taris asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Sergeant Hayes mentioned bad news." "The bad news," Briggs said, pulling a datapad toward him, "is that what you just fought outside wasn't an invasion force." Taris felt his blood run cold. "They slaughtered my entire battalion. They wiped out 3 cities in a week. They numbered in the millions. They were a scouting party," Briggs said, flatly. He turned the datapad around. It displayed a massive swirling cloud of red dots moving through deep space. The sheer number of contacts was incomprehensible. It was a mechanical locust swarm the size of a solar system. "That is the main hive," Briggs continued. "It's currently ripping through the outer colonies of the Krell. They'll be here in exactly 4 days. When they arrive, they won't just bomb this planet. They will strip mine the crust, boil the oceans, and use the raw materials to build more of themselves." Taris slumped back in his chair. The crushing weight of the reality settled over him. "Then we are dead. Even with your weapons, Colonel, you cannot fight a swarm that size. It is mathematically impossible." Briggs smiled. It was a terrifying, cold expression. It was the smile of a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to spit in its face. Commander, humanity has been fighting mathematically impossible wars since we figured out how to sharpen sticks, Briggs said, leaning back and crossing his arms. You fight to win. The Vector fight to exterminate. Briggs picked up the flask, took a long pull, and set it back down with a heavy thud. We fight to make the other guy die for his cause. You see a swarm. I see a target-rich environment. The Vector have a core intelligence, a central processing node that coordinates the hive. We call it the Queen. Briggs tapped the center of the red swarm on the datapad. If we break the Queen, the swarm fractures. They lose their cohesion. They become individual dumb machines. Still dangerous, but manageable. And how do you propose we reach this Queen? Terrace asked, disbelief coloring his tone. It is shielded by billions of drones. No fleet could penetrate that defense screen. A fleet can't, Briggs agreed. A fleet is too loud, too slow. They'll see it coming a parsec away. Briggs looked over at Hayes, who was leaning against the bulkhead, quietly cleaning her shotgun. She didn't look up, but she nodded once. We're not sending a fleet, Briggs said softly. We're sending a strike team. We're going to bypass their early warning network by riding one of their own dead dreadnoughts right into the center of the swarm. Then we are going to manually detonate a localized singularity warhead directly inside the Queen's processing core. Terrace's jaw dropped. It was suicide. It was beyond suicide. It was madness. You intend to use a black hole weapon, Terrace gasped. The Council banned those centuries ago. The collateral damage. The Council isn't here, Terrace. Briggs snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. The Council is hiding under their desks on Corellia Prime. This is the dirt. This is the mud. This is where survival happens. You want to live. You throw out the rulebook. Briggs stood up, towering over the Coda commander. I need your localized telemetry data. I need your knowledge of this system's gravitational currents. And I need you to hold this rock for exactly 72 hours while we prep the payload. Taurus looked at the scarred human, then at the map, and finally at the bourbon flask. His elegant, civilized worldview had been shattered, replaced by the brutal, unyielding pragmatism of the humans. They were monsters, but right now facing the cold, mechanical jaws of extinction, a monster was exactly what the galaxy needed. Terrace reached out, grabbed the datapad, and pulled it toward him. 72 hours, Terrace said, his voice firming up. I will give you 72 hours, Colonel. May the ancestors forgive us both. Briggs nodded slowly. They won't. But at least they'll be alive to complain about it. The air in the command dropship seemed to thicken, weighed down by the gravity of Briggs's plan. Terrace stared at the scrolling data on the pad, his four-fingered hands trembling slightly. He wasn't just committing his men to a desperate holding action. He was endorsing the use of a weapon so horrific, it tore the very fabric of space-time. The Coda had spent generations burying the blueprints of such devices. The humans had apparently brought one in their trunk. How many men are you taking on this strike team? Terrace asked, desperate to find a logical flaw, a reason to pull back from the edge of the abyss. 12, Hayes spoke up from the corner, her voice carrying that same cynical weariness. She slammed a fresh shell into her shotgun with a sharp metallic clack. Myself, Miller, a few of the heavy gunners, and a demo specialist named Carter. We go in light fast and completely off the grid. 12 humans against the heart of the Vector swarm, Taurus murmured, shaking his head. It defies all strategic doctrine. You will be vaporized before you even breach the inner perimeter of the Queen's dreadnought." "That's why we're not flying in," Briggs replied, tapping the map again. "We salvaged a Vector command cruiser 3 cycles ago, ripped out its brain, hot-wired its propulsion, and slapped a cloaking baffle on its exhaust ports. To their sensors, we'll look like a heavily damaged drone returning to the hive for repairs. We slip through the outer ring dock with the central carrier and walk the bomb right to their front door." Taris looked at the scarred faces of the 2 humans. There was no fear in their eyes. There was only a grim, unwavering resolve. It was the look of a species intimately acquainted with the concept of a last stand. "And the holding action here?" Taris asked, forcing his mind back to his own grim reality. "My men are exhausted. We have no heavy artillery left. The Vector will adapt to your kinetic bombardment tactics." "They will," Briggs agreed. "Which is why we're changing the game. I'm leaving a company of my best trench fighters with you. We're digging in. We're lacing no man's land with enough high explosives to crack the tectonic plates. When the swarm comes back, we don't fight them in the open. We funnel them into kill zones. We make them bleed for every inch of mud." Briggs leaned in close, his pale eyes burning. "You hold the line, Commander, no matter what. You don't retreat. You don't surrender. You make the Vector calculate that taking Oakhaven is too costly. You distract them. You make enough noise down here so they don't look up." Taris understood. They were the bait. His men and the human soldiers staying behind were nothing more than a noisy, bloody distraction. It was a cold, brutal calculus. "We will hold," Taris said, his voice surprisingly steady. He surprised himself with the conviction in his tone. The human pragmatism was infectious. "We will make them pay." Briggs nodded, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his scarred face. "Good man. Now, get back to your troops. Tell them to rest. Tomorrow, the real war begins." As Taris walked out of the dropship and back into the choking ash of Oakhaven, he looked up at the bruised purple sky. The galaxy had shunned humanity, locked them away in the dark, fearing their violence. But as Taris listened to the distant rhythmic thud of human engineers laying minefields in the mud, he realized the ultimate truth of the universe. When the dark comes to consume you, you don't pray for a saint. You pray for a devil who hates the dark just as much as you do. The next 72 hours blurred into a suffocating nightmare of mud sweat and high explosives. There was no sleep. There was only the dirt. Taris worked alongside his remaining Coda soldiers and the human engineers, hauling thick spools of monomolecular razor wire across the shattered expanse of no man's land. The rain had returned, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the battlefield into a slick, treacherous bog. It coated their armor and seeped into their joints, making every movement a grueling test of endurance. The humans didn't seem to notice the cold. They worked with an obsessive, terrifying energy. Taris watched a heavy weapons specialist named Cole, the same massive soldier who had carried the rotary cannon, supervise the placement of the mines. They weren't using standard proximity charges. The humans were burying massive cylindrical drums packed with highly volatile chemical accelerants and wrapped in layers of jagged scrap metal. Cole referred to them affectionately as daisy cutters. "You bury them deep," Cole grunted, kicking a layer of thick mud over one of the massive steel drums. His armor was caked in grime, the white skull on his chest plate barely visible. "The Vector are heavy. They step on the pressure plate. The primary charge blows the dirt away, and the secondary charge detonates the fuel. It doesn't just blast them, it cooks them inside their own armor. Terrace stared at the hidden explosive. The sheer malice of the design was staggering. The Coda fought to disable. The humans fought to inflict maximum suffering on an enemy that couldn't even feel pain. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of total war. "You have turned the Earth itself into a weapon," Terrace said, wiping a smear of blue blood and gray mud from his cracked visor. Cole looked up, wiping his brow with a filthy gauntlet. "The Earth doesn't care who walks on it, Commander, but it's real good at keeping secrets. By the time those toasters realize they've walked into a meat grinder, they won't have legs left to run away." Further down the trench line, human combat engineers were operating heavy-tracked machinery they had dropped from orbit. They weren't building walls. They were digging deep, angled trenches that zigzagged across the battlefield, creating artificial canyons in the mud. Terrace quickly realized the tactical purpose. They were building funnels. When the vector swarm advanced, they would naturally follow the path of least resistance, pouring into the deep trenches to avoid the heavy orbital debris littering the surface. And at the end of every funnel, the humans had positioned heavy machine gun nests and twin-linked plasma cannons salvaged from dead Coda vehicles. It was an industrial slaughterhouse assembly line. Kale limped out of the medical tent, his neck heavily bandaged with thick white gauze. He leaned heavily on a discarded rifle for support. He stood next to Terrace, looking out over the fortified landscape. The graceful, energy-shielded parapets of the Coda had been replaced by a brutalist nightmare of spiked barricades, sunken pits, and overlapping fields of ballistic fire. "It is ugly," Kale whispered, his voice raspy from the crude stitches in his throat. "We have defiled our own world. We are ensuring we have a world left to defile," Terrace corrected him flatly. He looked at Kyle. The young officer's eyes had lost their innocent sheen. The trauma of the human medical intervention, combined with the sheer brutality of their new allies, had hardened him. "Do not mourn the dirt, Kale. Mourn the dead. The dirt will wash away in a few centuries." On the evening of the third day, the sky began to change. The bruised purple clouds were slowly swallowed by a creeping unnatural darkness. It wasn't the setting of the sun. It was an eclipse. Terrace stood on the edge of the command trench, his helmet magnification zoomed in on the upper atmosphere. Millions of tiny glowing red pinpricks blotted out the stars. It looked like a cloud of burning ash drifting across the heavens. The main Vector hive had arrived. The low-frequency hum of their mass transit engines sent a deep, vibrating ache into Terrace's bones. It was a sound that triggered primal terror, a sound that promised the end of all biological life. A heavy hand clapped down on Terrace's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He knew the grip. Captain Reynolds, the human officer left in charge of the Planetary Defense Force, stepped up beside him. Reynolds was a tall, lean man with a face like tanned leather and a perpetually unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. He carried a long, heavily modified sniper rifle wrapped in muddy camouflage netting. "Look at them," Reynolds muttered, staring up at the darkening sky. "Like roaches crowding around a porch light. There are too many," Terrace said. The fatalism was creeping back into his voice. Despite the traps, despite the guns, the sheer mathematics of the swarm overhead were insurmountable. "Even if we kill 10 for every one of us, we will run out of ammunition long before they run out of machines." "We don't have to kill them all, Commander." Reynolds replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. He pulled the bolt back on his rifle, checking the chamber before snapping it shut. We just have to keep them looking down. We make a lot of noise. We scream, we bite, we scratch. We give Briggs the time he needs. The first drop pods began to fall. They didn't come down in hundreds. They came down in tens of thousands. The sky rained streaks of burning iron. The impact tremors hit the ground like a rolling earthquake, throwing Coda and human soldiers alike against the trench walls. Taris drew his sidearm. He had scavenged a fresh power cell from a dead comrade. He looked down the line of his battered platoon. Beside them stood the human heavy infantry. Their massive weapons primed their faceless visors, glowing a dull, predatory red in the gloom. "Fix bayonets!" a human sergeant roared over the comms. The sound of thick steel blades locking into heavy rifles echoed down the trench line. From the smoke of the impact craters, the red optical sensors illuminated. The Vector had landed. The swarm began its advance, a silent, terrifying tide of jagged metal and glowing plasma. "Wait for it," Reynolds said over the tactical net. His voice was a cold whisper. "Let them get into the mud. Let them taste the funnels." The leading edge of the machine horde hit the hidden minefields. The mud erupted. Massive pillars of liquid fire shot hundreds of feet into the air. The shock waves hit the trenches a second later, a wall of blistering heat and deafening sound. The daisy cutters detonated in a synchronized chain, tearing massive fiery holes in the Vector lines. Thousands of machines were instantly vaporized or melted into useless slag, but the swarm didn't pause. The machines behind simply climbed over the burning molten chassis of the vanguard, pushing forward relentlessly. They hit the deep trenches funneled exactly where the human engineers wanted them. "Light them up!" Reynolds barked. The kill zones roared to life. Rotary cannons, heavy shotguns, and salvaged plasma batteries unleashed a solid wall of concentrated destruction into the packed ranks of the Vector. The screaming of metal tearing metal was deafening. Taris fired his sidearm into the mass of machines, the blue energy bolts punching through synthetic armor. He wasn't a commander anymore. He was just a soldier holding the line at the edge of the world. He glanced up at the sky, the red glow of the hive mocking their desperate struggle. "We are holding the door," Colonel Taris thought, ducking as a plasma bolt singed the top of his helmet. "Do not miss." Deep in the cold void of high orbit, the salvaged Vector command cruiser drifted silently through the dark. It looked exactly like a piece of dead debris. Its hull was scorched, heavily pitted from kinetic impacts and leaking trace amounts of dark coolant fluid. Its main thrusters were offline. It moved entirely on low-emission chemical maneuvering thrusters, coasting on a trajectory that would take it directly into the heart of the mechanical swarm. Inside the gutted command center of the cruiser, the air was freezing. The humans had disabled the life support systems to minimize their thermal signature. Colonel Briggs stood near the forward observation viewport, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He wore a thick, environmentally sealed combat suit beneath his heavy armor. His pale eyes tracked the massive, jagged shapes of the Vector dreadnoughts drifting past them. "Distance to the Queen's carrier?" Briggs asked. His voice was a low rumble over the encrypted short-range comms. 3,000 kilometers and closing, boss," Carter replied. The demolition specialist was kneeling on the floor, grating his fingers, flying across the cracked screen of a salvaged Vector terminal. He was tapped directly into the ship's navigation array, spoofing their identification codes to match a heavily damaged drone returning for emergency recycling. They're scanning us. Passive sweeps only. The cloaking baffle is holding. Sergeant Hayes stood near the main airlock door, her shotgun resting across her chest. She chewed on a piece of unlit tobacco, her eyes constantly scanning the dark corners of the gutted ship. "I don't like this," she muttered. "It's too quiet. We're riding a dead horse into a slaughterhouse." "Quiet is what keeps us alive," Sergeant Briggs replied, without looking away from the window. "Once we breach the Queen's hull, you'll have all the noise you can handle." The Vector fleet was a terrifying sight up close. They weren't built for comfort or aesthetics. They were massive geometric nightmares of black metal bristling with sensory arrays and heavy plasma lances. They communicated in bursts of microwave radiation, creating a silent, invisible web of data that connected billions of drones to the central intelligence. And in the center of the web hung the Queen. It wasn't a ship. It was a mobile fortress. A massive spherical construct easily the size of a small moon surrounded by concentric rings of heavy defensive platforms. Its surface crawled with millions of maintenance drones repairing minor armor fractures and processing raw materials harvested from a dozen dead worlds. This was the brain of the extermination protocol. "We are approaching the outer defensive ring," Carter whispered, his voice tense. "Uploading the final spoofing protocols now. If they realize our reactor signature doesn't match a standard vector core, we get vaporized in about 4 seconds." Briggs gripped the edge of the viewport. "Hold your breath." Outside, a massive vector defense platform slowly turned its heavy plasma batteries toward their drifting ship. Red optical scanning beams washed over the scorched hull, penetrating the outer layers of armor. Inside the dark cabin, the red light swept over Briggs, Hayes, and Carter, illuminating their tense, breath-held faces. For 10 agonizing seconds, the scanning beams lingered. The targeting computers of the defense platform analyzed the chemical composition, the trajectory, and the false identification codes Carter was feeding them. Then the red beams clicked off. The heavy plasma batteries rotated away, returning to their neutral patrol positions. "We're through." Carter let out a long, shaky breath, wiping sweat from his freezing forehead. "They bought it. We are officially classified as organic contaminated debris, designated for interior recycling. They're opening the main hangar doors on the Queen's southern hemisphere. Engage the auto-docking sequence," Briggs ordered, stepping away from the window. He picked up his heavy pulse rifle from the tactical crate. "Check your seals. Check your ammo. Once we step off this tub, there is no turning back. We have exactly 20 minutes to reach the central processing core plant, the payload, and find an egress route." "And if we don't find an egress route," Miller the medic asked from the back of the cabin, "then you make sure you're standing right next to the bomb when it goes off," Hayes said, flatly racking the slide of her shotgun. "Beats getting dissected by a toaster." The dead cruiser drifted heavily into the massive, yawning hangar of the Queen's fortress. The interior was a cavernous, terrifying expanse of automated industry. Massive robotic arms hung from the ceiling, pulling damaged vector drones apart with ruthless efficiency. Conveyor belts the size of highways carried scrapped metal and harvested organic material toward deep, glowing, smelting furnaces. The noise was a deafening, rhythmic clanging of metal on metal, underscored by the low hum of the station's massive power grid. With a heavy grinding thud, the cruiser locked into a magnetic docking clamp. "Docking complete," Carter said, unhooking himself from the terminal. He turned and hoisted a massive rectangular metal case onto his back. It was heavy enough that the servos in his armor whined in protest. Inside that case was the localized singularity warhead, a weapon that would compress the entire station into an area the size of a golf ball before violently expanding outward. "Blow the airlock," Briggs commanded. Hayes stepped forward, placing a small, shaped breaching charge on the sealed door. She stepped back, holding up 3 fingers. 2. 1. A sharp, muffled crack echoed in the cabin, followed by the hiss of escaping atmosphere. The heavy metal doors groaned and kicked outward, dropping onto the deck of the Vector hangar. The humans moved with fluid, practiced lethality. Briggs was out first, his rifle raised, scanning the immediate area. Hayes followed, covering the flank, while Miller and Carter pushed out with the payload. They were standing on a massive maintenance gantry overlooking the recycling pits. Below them, thousands of worker drones scuttled back and forth, entirely ignoring the human intruders. They were programmed to recognize threats via the central network. Since the network had classified the docked ship as debris, the biological entities stepping out of it were simply an anomaly. The worker drones lacked the subroutines to process. "They don't see us," Miller whispered, his rifle tracking a passing drone. "It's like we're ghosts." "Don't get comfortable," Briggs replied, pointing down a dark, heavily shielded corridor that led toward the center of the sphere. "The worker drones are blind. The combat sentries won't be. Keep your profiles low and your weapons hot. Carter, give me a heading." "Straight down this access tunnel for 2 kilometers, Carter said, checking his wrist-mounted tactical display. "Then we take a primary turbo lift down to the core level." They moved fast shadows, slipping through a world built for machines. They bypassed heavily patrolled intersections by crawling through massive ventilation shafts that smelled of ozone and scorched copper. They were in the belly of the beast, a mile deep inside a machine intelligence that wanted to end their species. They reached the end of the access tunnel without incident. Before them stood massive, heavily armored blast doors, guarding the turbo lift to the core. "Carter, get these doors open," Briggs ordered, taking up a defensive position behind a stack of metal crates. Carter knelt by the control panel, pulling out a heavy data spike. He jammed it into the port, his fingers flying across his data pad as he initiated the slicing software. "Give me 60 seconds. Their encryption is aggressive." Suddenly, the low hum of the station changed pitch. It was a subtle shift, but Briggs felt it in his teeth. The heavy blast doors didn't open. Instead, the control panel Carter was working on sparked, violently turning a bright molten red. Carter jerked his hands back just before the panel shorted out completely. "Boss," Carter said, his voice dropping an octave. "The system just locked me out, not a passive firewall, an active, localized purge. Something in the network just realized we aren't supposed to be here." Down the long corridor they had just traversed, the overhead lights flickered, shifting from a cold, sterile white to a deep, angry crimson. A mechanical shriek echoed down the hall, loud enough to rattle the plating on their armor. It wasn't the sound of worker drones. It was the sound of heavy hunter-killer units deploying. "Ghost protocol is blown," Hayes yelled, raising her shotgun as the first jagged, razor-limbed shapes appeared in the red gloom at the far end of the corridor. "Form up!" Briggs roared, his rifle barking as he laid down suppressive fire. "We bleed them here. Nobody dies until that bomb is planted." The true monsters of the galaxy had just been caged inside the deadliest fortress ever constructed, and they were ready to bite back. The corridor became an inescapable meat grinder. There was no room for flanking, no cover to exploit. The humans simply planted their heavy boots onto the deck plating, and unleashed a blinding wall of hyper-accelerated lead into the red-lit gloom. The hunter-killers were entirely different from the drones on Oakhaven. They were sleek, heavily armored bipeds, armed with localized energy shielding and monomolecular blades. They didn't just run, they bounded off the walls, moving with a sickening arachnid grace. Their red optical slits tracked biological movement with flawless predictive algorithms. Concentrate fire. Briggs roared, his pulse rifle overheating as he dumped a full magazine into the leading machine. The armor-piercing rounds shattered its energy shield and chewed through its central chassis. It collapsed, sliding across the metal floor in a shower of sparks, but 3 more immediately took its place, stepping seamlessly over their fallen unit without a fraction of hesitation. Hayes stepped forward, her heavy shotgun barking. The percussive blast in the enclosed space was physically painful, but the devastating spread of buckshot sheared the razor limbs off a leaping hunter-killer in midair. She didn't aim. She simply created a wall of flying tungsten. "Carter, the door!" she screamed over the deafening roar of gunfire. "I can't slice it." The Queen severed the physical connection, Carter yelled back, frantically tearing into his demolition pack. "I have to blow it manually. I need cover." "You have your cover, get it done," Briggs ordered. Miller was on his knee, firing precise bursts into the optical sensors of the advancing machines. A plasma bolt grazed his shoulder pauldron, melting the armor and scorching the flesh beneath. He didn't even flinch. He just gritted his teeth and kept pulling the trigger, the pain barely registering over the massive spike of combat adrenaline. Down on the mud-choked surface of Oakhaven, the situation was equally desperate. The deep funnels the humans had dug were completely filled with destroyed vector chassis. The machines were no longer falling into traps. They were walking over a bridge made of their own dead. The rain turned the battlefield into a slick, treacherous nightmare of oil blood and freezing water. Terrace crouched in the command trench, firing his sidearm until the power cell clicked dry. He tossed the useless weapon into the mud and drew his ceremonial combat knife. It felt pathetic in his grip, a sliver of decorative steel against a tide of relentless steel. The Coda doctrine of precise, honorable combat was a distant, laughable memory. A massive 4-legged assault drone crested the trench line, its plasma scythe glowing white-hot. Before it could swing, Cole stepped in. The massive heavy weapons specialist didn't have his rotary cannon anymore. The barrel had melted into a solid lump of useless slag 10 minutes ago. Instead, Cole held a heavy entrenching tool, a shovel. He swung it with the brutal kinetic force of a sledgehammer, catching the machine directly in its primary sensory cluster. The thick metal of the shovel dented, but the machine's optics shattered. Cole followed up with a brutal kick to its front joint, dropping the drone into the mud before driving the edge of the shovel deep into its exposed neck housing. Black oil geysered over his shattered armor. "Hold the line," Reynolds yelled from his sniper perch, his rifle cracking methodically. Every shot dropped a high-value vector target, but it was like trying to empty an ocean with a spoon. "They're pushing the left flank. Do not let them breach the aid station." Taurus watched the humans fight. They were bleeding. They were exhausted. Their armor was failing. Yet their aggression only escalated. They fought with a terrifying joy, screaming curses into the rain as they physically beat the machines to death. They were magnificent, horrible creatures. Back on the Queen, a deafening explosion rocked the access corridor. Carter had slapped a breaching charge directly onto the locking mechanism of the blast doors. The heavy metal buckled outward, tearing off its hinges in a cloud of smoke and vaporized steel. "Move, move, move!" Briggs shoved Carter through the jagged opening. Hayes fired one last blast from her shotgun, grabbed Miller by the harness, and hauled him through the breach. Briggs covered their retreat, tossing a pair of fragmentation grenades down the hall before diving through the twisted metal. The grenades detonated, collapsing the corridor ceiling and burying the pursuing hunter-killers under tons of metal grating. The strike team scrambled to their feet, weapons raised. They had breached the core. The chamber was vast, cold, and entirely silent. It was a massive sphere lined with millions of glowing data conduits that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening heartbeat. In the center of the room hung a monolithic cylinder of black glass and chrome. This was the central processing node, the mind of the extermination protocol. The air felt heavy, saturated with raw, oppressive data streams. "Plant it," Briggs ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Carter ran toward the central pillar, unlatching the heavy rectangular case from his back. He dropped it onto the floor, grating with a heavy thud, and popped the latches. Inside, the Singularity warhead hummed a compact nightmare of gravitational physics contained within a heavy lead housing. Carter's fingers flew across the arming keypad. He engaged the primary sequencer. He typed in the authorization codes, bypassing the physical failsafes. The screen flashed red. Error. Containment breach in primary ignition. Cell. Carter froze. He looked closer at the casing. A stray plasma bolt from the corridor fight had clipped the edge of the box, cleanly severing the remote detonation relay. "Boss," Carter's voice was hollow. "The remote timer is dead. The ignition cell took a hit. I can bypass the safety interlocks and trigger the Singularity directly from the main board." But he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. A manual detonation meant the operator was staying behind. It was a one-way trip to the center of a black hole. The heavy blast doors they had just blown open began to groan. The vector were cutting through the collapsed ceiling. Sparks showered into the room. They had less than a minute. Briggs walked over to the bomb. He looked at the shattered relay, then up at Carter. "Show me how to trigger it," Briggs said quietly. "Colonel, no." Hayes stepped forward, her voice tight. "I'll do it. You need to lead the team back. There's a maintenance shaft right behind the core that vents to the exterior. You can jump and let the gravity well pull you out." Briggs turned to her. His scarred face was perfectly calm. "That's an order, Sergeant. I brought you into this dark. I'm making sure you get out of it. Carter, show me." Carter's hand shook, but he complied. He pulled a small, heavy toggle switch out from beneath the damaged circuit board. "You flip this. The containment field drops. Space-time collapses in exactly 3 seconds. The blast radius will consume everything within 2,000 kilometers. "Understood." Briggs took the toggle, his massive armored thumb resting on the switch. He looked at his team. "Get out of here. When you see Taris, tell him the debt is paid." Hayes stared at Briggs for a long second. She didn't salute. Humans didn't waste time on empty gestures when a job was done. She simply nodded a deep, silent acknowledgement of the price of survival. "Let's go." Hayes grabbed Carter's shoulder. Miller was already limping toward the maintenance shaft. Briggs stood alone in the shadow of the Queen's processing core. The blast doors behind him finally gave way, collapsing inward as a swarm of heavily